Gentle lady viewers and gentlemen viewers, good time of day, wherever you may find yourself now, and welcome to this episode of Shakespeare's Views on the News, titled One, None, 100,000, which is the title of a novel printed in 1926, 100 years ago, by Italian playwright Luigi Pirandello. As for the reason for this title, I will get into it later. Time, thou ceaseless lackey of eternity, says Lady Lucrece in the only long poem written by Shakespeare besides, of course, the sonnets, which the sonnets in this classification could be considered short poems. A ceaseless lackey of eternity, time, which once more has brought us to the summer of 2026, and quoting possibly from the meteorological political Shakespeare, we could perhaps say, "Now is the winter of our discontent, but glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried." Now, as we recall, the son of York who made the summer glorious was King Edward IV. And this famous quote, appearing at the beginning of the play Richard III, could possibly trigger a mind correction with the artificial intelligence character that Donald Trump has chosen to impersonate. Or who knows, Shakespeare himself may nominate Trump as the new and current son of York. Of course, the association of Trump with Richard III is intended as a mild irony with no implied disrespect whatsoever. Yet, with a large measure of poetic license, and considering that Donald Trump likes to represent himself online, as he has done recently, in the garb of the Pope or of Jesus, or as Jesus as a physician, I am not suggesting that the idea has no value of itself, though, to be fair, Trump has removed from the Jesus at the moment. He has removed the Jesus impersonation. There is no limit to what can be done in the way of finding consolation from minor misfortunes by means of bizarre analogies and quaint parallels. In fairness, we cannot know what triggers Trump to assume different characters online using the ever upgraded possibilities of artificial intelligence. It could be perhaps an understandable desire to escape from his own role by means of the imagination, or at least subconsciously to think that he is one and many at the same time. Which brings me to the explanation of the title of this episode of Shakespeare's Views on the News, One, None, 100,000. One, None, 100,000 is the last and most famous novel by Italian playwright Luigi Pirandello, of which, by the way, there exists an English version, in which novel the protagonist falls into a deep crisis when his wife points to a small imperfection on his nose. From there on, he realized that he is not one, as he thought, but 100,000, the number of people that he thinks are looking at him, and ultimately no one. Because the only way to free himself from society's label is to renounce all identity. Whereupon he disposes of all his earthly goods and volunteers into a kind of retirement home and at the same time a psychiatric clinic. Yet, apart from the novel, from which this episode takes the title, and from another point of view, if we wish to further examine Trump's performance psychologically, Trump demonstrates the validity of the content and of the sense of the lines from Midsummer Night's Dream. the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Of which lines the recent imaginative Trump's online as artificial intelligence transformations may be considered an appropriate example, perhaps with only modifications, namely the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imaginations all compact, and as imagination bodies forth, Trump's imagination turns them into shapes and gives to airy nothing the forms of himself in their garb and features. Now, good heavens, far from me to use the stage of Shakespeare's use on the news to promote my dictionary, Your Daily Shakespeare, an arsenal of verbal weapons to drive your friends into action and your enemies into despair. Yet, in the instance I refer to the aforesaid dictionary only to demonstrate with an actual example Shakespeare's versatility of applications when it comes to adapt his lines to various facets of contemporary life or of life in general. Where, in my dictionary, the lines I just quoted appear listed under the heading Profession, Possible Answer to Questions, What do you do for a living? Lines usable in the context of a conversation, as an example, with an attractive woman. And here I quote directly from the dictionary as for the possible applications of this quote. This is where, these lines, you establish your standing in the perception of the lady in question. Perhaps she may expect you to have a glamorous profession, for example, a heart or brain surgeon, a trial lawyer, a very visible and alas crooked executive from Enron or WorldCom or Kmart, or a visible and equally crooked high-profile Anderson auditor, an investment firm executive, or a high-profile accountant. By the way, the examples of application used for these lines of themselves are a reminder of a history not so distant as to have been completely forgotten. And opening here a parenthesis among the parentheses, the examples extracted from the dictionary in the context of how to use the quote fearfully remind me, and remind all of us perhaps, of another topic application of a different quote. Time, thou ceaseless lackey of eternity. For, in the context of this quote, time, thou ceaseless lackey of eternity, the galactic failure and corruption of Enron is now but the recurrent case of a name that sounds familiar to some, meaningless to most, and vaguely remembered by others. The same outcome applies to WorldCom, that became famous for a massive corporate accounting fraud in 2002, where executive inflated the company's assets by approximately $11 million at the time, equivalent probably to about $25 million of today. As for Enron, and many probably still remember, they concealed declining profits while maintaining an artificially high stock price, while senior management manipulated finances by listing operating expenses as long-term capital assets, thus inflating revenues in a manner that many would consider almost cartoonish. And actually, I am surprised that the genial financial discovery of Enron has not increased in popularity. That is, list your losses as gains, and on the strength of those gains, get the banks to lend you more money to finance more losses. We could say, who cannot be in awe of genius, where genius is so clearly demonstrated, regrettably or fortunately, depending, of course, on your point of view and on the perception that you have of yourself vis-à-vis the world. And to conclude this quick off-the-main theme retrospective, Kmart, has gone the way of all flesh, as well as many other characters and, at the time, massive enterprises involved in those scandals. Equally, this entry in my dictionary called the Shakespeare Views on the News shows indirectly that my dictionary is, through the example of application of Shakespeare lines, a mirror of relatively recent times that now, nevertheless, are already part of history. But, returning to today's episode, some may wonder or perhaps may still ponder or may ask themselves with Hamlet, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And perhaps conclude more soberly still with Hamlet, and yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me. As you know, Hamlet adds and actually concludes with the line, man delights not me, nor woman either, though by your smiley you may seem to say so. For what is worth, in principle, I tend to disagree with Hamlet's sequitur about women, though when observing the externations of some women who currently ride the tide of pomp that beats upon the high shores of this world, which comes from Henry V, it is difficult to disagree with Hamlet's extended and pessimistic conclusions. But I digressed from the original intent related to the application of the quote. If you, sympathetic viewer, have none of the glamorous profession that I quoted before, or practice none of these glamorous professions, or if your profession is inherently unglamorous, or if you are unemployed, you have the same options as when dealing with age, that is, lie or deflect the question. With age, for example, you may answer, if and when asked, though not clean past my youth, hath yet some smack of age in me, some relish of the saltness of time, and that comes from part 2 of Henry IV, by the way. But returning to answering the question as to what you do for a living, here is one option obtained from modifying mildly the original lines. What do you do for a living? She may ask, and she may ask, or he may ask, and you may reply, as my imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, my pen turns them into shapes, and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Of course, given the tone of our times and the current standard educational criteria, your date may silently question your mental sanity. Nevertheless, your answer assumes that you are actually a writer. Who else, after all, can turn into shapes the form of things unknown? Yet, even here, some caution is advisable. Writing is a profession that, historically, not long ago, yielded unforgettable classics written by unforgettable and legendary authors, including, of course, William Shakespeare, who inspires this series, this modest series. Today, however, just as with currency, with the exception perhaps of the Chinese renminbi, or however it is pronounced, even writing and writers have been subject to an inflation of extraordinary dimensions and scope. And this, without even considering that artificial intelligence can miraculously transform a barely literate individual into a potential Nobel Prize in literature. A potential that increases geometrically if you can hire a professional scribe to write the book for you. In a previous episode, I made reference to one of Trump's original books titled Think Big and Kick Ass. Most recently, another potential bestseller hit the bookshops. The title described the content, namely Melania. Perhaps Shakespeare would comment as in Romeo and Juliet, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as a sweet." And comparing Melania to a rose for some may be what is called a stretch. Yet in this instance, Melania apparently applied the concept expressed in the following lines from Julius Caesar. "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea we're now afloat, and we must take the current as it serves, or lose our ventures." Applying the concept or idea to Melania and others similar, every civilized man or woman has, I suppose, some picture of himself or herself and is annoyed when anything happens that seems to spoil this picture. The best cure, according to Bertrand Russell, is to have not only one picture or idea of ourselves, but a whole gallery, and to select the one appropriate to the occasion. If some of the portraits are a trifle laughable, so much the better. It is not wise to see oneself all day long as a hero of high tragedy. Equally, one should not see oneself always as a clown in a comedy. For those who do this, they think to be amusing when they are not, they are even more irritating. Therefore, a little tact is required in choosing a role appropriate to the situation. Of course, if you can forget yourself and not play any part at all, that is admirable. But if playing a part has become second nature, choose carefully in your repertory so as to avoid monotony. There is no limit to what can be done in the way of finding consolation from minor misfortunes by means of bizarre analogies and quaint parallels. Every civilized man or woman has, I suppose, or we suppose, some picture of himself or herself, and is annoyed when anything happens that seems to spoil this picture. The best cure, as I just said, is to have not only one picture of yourself, but a whole gallery, and to select the one appropriate to the incident or to the moment in question. If some of the portraits are a trifle laughable, so much the better. It is not wise to see oneself all day long as a hero of high tragedy. I do not suggest here that one should see oneself always as a clown in a comedy, for those who do this are even more irritating. A little tact is required in choosing a role appropriate to the situation. Equally, if you can forget yourself and not play a part at all, that is also admirable. But if playing a part has become second nature, consider that you act according to a repertory so as to avoid monotony. This quote, as I just recited, appears in Bertrand Russell's book titled The Impact of Science on Society, which was first published in 1952. You may view an individual as a common man, as a hero, or as a cog in the machine. The first view leads to old-fashioned democracy, the common man that is. The second, the hero, leads to fascism, and the third, as a cog in the machine, leads to communism. Russell uses these three viewpoints to explain different political styles. The view of the common man builds a democracy. It treats everyone equally. It says that every regular citizen matters. The view of the hero builds fascism. It focuses on worshipping one powerful, extraordinary leader. And the third, the cog in the machine that is, the view builds communism. It treats the individual as just a small part of a giant state network. Russell argues that a healthy democracy needs to balance these three views. He points out that we all play these different roles at times. For example, even a famous artist is just a common man when waiting in line to vote, and so on. Actually, to expand on the characterization proposed by Bertrand Russell, he wrote this particular essay at a time when computers were still a somewhat obscure novelty. As regards to the hero viewpoint, the times, especially from the technological point of view, as you know, have evolved and expanded dramatically. As Trump himself has shown, it is now much easier to be or pretend to be with suitable technology, pretend to be what we are not. Actually, many have this natural propensity and talent in this regard, which has both its good and questionable points. Not to press the point further, when Melania declared in her immigration papers that she had a degree in architecture, a PhD, maybe another that I don't remember, and that she spoke five languages, in her own way, Melania's curriculum and self-description dramatically demonstrate Bertrand Russell's point about a man's or woman's generalized need to be a hero or a heroine. And, as Trump himself has demonstrated, it is now possible and realistic to be one different hero for each day of the week. Choice, imagination, and perseverance are the only limits. But let's not be too harsh in judgment. And remaining in the arena of politics and gossip, for those who in their youth studied the classics, one of the Latin texts at school was the Parallel Lives by Plutarch. They are a series of biographies of famous Greeks and Romans examined to compare their moral virtues and vices, and how character shaped their lives and destinies. I don't think that Latin is among the 5 languages that Melania professed to speak. As you know, during recent weeks, another parallel character sprang to life, namely her previous bosom friend and now bitter enemy, Amanda Ungaro. By the way, it's Ungaro and not Ungaro, as the media insists saying, but let that go. And next, in the spirit of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, the book from which the next short video takes its title, Shakespeare's Views on the News presents 2 snippets of parallel speeches by the 2 aforementioned parallel heroines, Melania and Amanda.
Good afternoon. The lies linking me with the disgraceful Jeffrey Epstein need to end today. The individuals lying about me are devoid of ethical standards, humility, and respect.
Trump was Jeffrey Epstein, she was a escort of Jeffrey Epstein. That's how she met Donald Trump, okay? You are like a piece of shit.
What can one say? Shakespeare himself will probably say, I am so attired in wonder, I know not what to say. And by the way, the lines are from the play Much Ado About Nothing. Thank you for watching, and as usual, may all the number of the stars give light to your fair way.